Looks like we're gonna get started in about a minute here. I'm doing my last minute prep on my sewing machine.
Your sewing machine's very pretty.
It is. I like it a lot. I need to take it into the sewing machine doctor. It is 11 o'clock, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. First off, by beginning the recording. Sweet. And then, so the recording has something to latch on to. This is Journeyman Laeta's Satin-Stitch Applique class for Online Chaos Wars 2020. This class will go until noon today. If it runs long, we will retire to the Discord chat where we can continue chatting about Satin-Stitch. Satin-Stitch is well loved by many crafters in our community, and it takes a long time. I am going to say right now that applique does not mean Satin-Stitch. Applique just means one piece of fabric being sewn onto another piece of fabric, like a patch. So you don't have to do the fancy satin stitch for it to count as an applique. It can be a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch or anything, and it still technically counts as applique. That's a misnomer I've heard, and I just wanted to correct it and make sure we all had a good foundation for what is applique. Satin-Stitch Applique is specifically the fancy, and I didn't grab any examples out, tight, lovely applique that is, thank you, Sven, that has this lovely smooth stitch all the way around this other type of fabric. And that's what we're going to talk about today. That's a lovely thingamajiggy. That's your master's, isn't it? Nice.
Yep.
That's what we're going to talk about today, is how to do a nice Satin-Stitch applique. And I'm actually going to cheat. And I have a fabric that already has the design on it. So I'm going to use this as my outline for the applique that I'm going to do rather than draw the design out. I saw it yesterday when I was working with this fabric, and I'm like, I'm going to do that. That's going to make my life easier. So applique takes a lot of layers. When you're appliquing something, you have your applique fabric, you have interfacing, and I just use a fusible interfacing. You have one-to-under, which is a double adhesive, and you have stabilizer. Oh, one-to-under. Then your fabric, you're appliquing it on top of, and then you have stabilizer. So we have 5 different layers of material here that we work with when we're doing a nice Satin-Stitch applique. So the first step you do is you always make sure everything's nice and ironed out, that your 2 fabrics are nice and ironed. So I'm starting by ironing out this kitty cat. And I like ironing on the back of my fabric. That way if something goes wrong, it's not the end of the universe. And that's just me. So if you trust, my iron also tends to overheat, so it likes marring my fabric. But if you trust your iron, then you can iron on the top of your fabric just fine. So after I have my base fabric lovely and ironed out, before I cut it out, if at all possible, you do this before you cut out your image that you're appliquing, I'm going to iron on my fusible interfacing. So fusible interfacing has little dots on it on one side and it's smooth on the other side. So the dots are what you're going to fuse to the other fabric. So make sure the dots are down on top, and you always want to position it so it covers all of your applique. And then I always try and do it just a little bit more than the applique image because it makes life easier. And because my iron overheats, I'm putting a fancy thing on top so it doesn't ruin my fabric. And you always just press down, and I always mentally count to 10. It might depend on your iron and your type of interfacing. I use lightweight fusible interfacing. Sometimes I'll use medium weight. If I'm going to be appliquing hand embroidery patch that I've done, I will use stitch on interfacing instead of iron on, because the iron on will make bunches around the threads because of how thick hand embroidery floss is. So I now have my fusible interfacing on the back side of my fabric. After I have my fusible interfacing on, I take my Wonder, and with Wonder has a fusible side and then it has a paper backing. Later on, we're going to take this paper backing. Did I hit recording? Yes, I did.
Yes, you're recording.
Sweet. I keep asking myself that like every single class. It has a paper backing and the fusible side. You're going to put the fusible side down, covering up the entirety of your applique, and a little bit more if you can, because it makes life easier. And then you iron it to fuse it. If you are using material you cannot iron down, most of Belle uses linen, so that doesn't happen very often because you can iron linen. But if you're using a synthetic or a polyester material that will melt with excessive heat, they do make spray basting in a can that you can spray on. You want to do it at this step, you would do it at the next step. But you can spray it onto your applique patch and use that to adhere it to your main fabric. So now that I have my applique fabric, my interfacing, and my Wonder on, I'm going to cut it out somewhere. I didn't think about this setup part. So I use a rotary cutter when I'm cutting out my satin stitch because I think it makes my life easier. If you don't have a rotary cutter, that is just fine. You can always just use scissors. So I flip it over so that I can see my applique pattern. Nice and clear and easy. And then I cut right on that line of my pattern. So here's my applique pattern. And I'm just going to cut right on that line. And it doesn't matter if you go off. And I'm usually listening to music or an audiobook or something while I'm doing this, or talking with friends, because it gets tedious, especially if you're doing an applique with a lot of detailing. Sweet. And I have my applique piece all cut out. I love the fact that I'm using something with my design lines already on it. But I'm not quite ready to put it to my fabric yet because I'm going to put something on the edges called no fray. Fray check. That will keep these edges from raveling. And I use it because I've seen Satin-Stitch Applique where the applique has pulled away from the main fabric, and then you have to go over and fix it again. And I find that applying this to the edges of the applique just helps keep that from happening. So it's just a small string, and you just do it to all the edges. And it's especially important for this material because it's a fairly thin material I'm working with right now. It's not as thick as a typical cotton or linen. But I'm just going on and I'm applying it to all the edges. If I had any cutouts in the middle, I would apply it to that. And it gets really good hand muscles. Sweet. Yeah. So I've now applied that to all the edges of this particular applique. So now my applique is ready to get some stitching done on it. So what I'm going to do is make sure my safety's on my rotary cutter. Is this applique has some detailing on the middle, and it's always nice to get any inside details done before you put it on the primary fabric that you're going to be backing it on. So I need to get my stabilizer, and I just need a tiny piece for this section. And I'm going to sew the stabilizer onto the kitty head. Okay, if I was you, I would sew the stabilizer onto the kitty head. I probably actually would have done these details before I cut it out, but I just decided to do it right now. So you would have sewn your stabilizer on before you cut it out. And then we're going to go to our machine and we're going to go to our satin stitch setting. So, set my machine thing up. Here's my machine. I have a computerized machine, so it makes my life easier. And I have a specific satin stitch. If you are using a basic machine, Sven, could you do me a favor? And no, you're on your desktop, aren't you?
I am, but what do you need?
I was thinking you could show one, not a computer machine.
I don't think I can do that.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. If you are not on a computer machine, you would go to a zigzag setting, and then you would set your stitch length at less than 1, but not quite 0. So it's like right on that edge of the in between the 0 and the 1, of in between, of almost at the 0 but not quite. On a computer machine, it's going to look, I don't even know if you guys can see, but here I'm at a satin stitch zigzag, and I just go down to 0.2 is the lowest my machine goes, and then either 0.2 or 0.1 makes for an excellent satin stitch. 0.5 can do it, but it doesn't look as nice or as clean. So your goal is a 0.2. And that transitions to the non-computer machine, where you're like right next to that zero, as close as you can be. And the next thing you want is a satin stitch foot. So a satin stitch foot has a groove in the back like this. That makes it so that the satin stitch runs through a lot smoother than it would with a basic foot, which looks like this. So here's our basic foot that doesn't have any kind of groove in it. And then a satin stitch foot has this lovely groove right here. It's fantastic. It made my life so much easier when I started using these. I have a Viking machine, and most machines come with a satin stitch foot. So mine is a machine foot B, is what the letter is, or you just look for that back that has that large groove in it. And it makes life so much easier. So that's the foot you're going to use, and once you have your machine settings ready and you have your stabilizer on, I'm doing my inside details first. And I always set my needle down first, and then I like doing a security stitch with satin stitching, but you don't have to. And a big thing with satin stitching is just going slow. As slow as you need to. If you push your fabric through though, so when you're doing a curve, you just go a little bit slower than you do a straight line. So you don't want to be too mean and push the fabric through, or it'll have a wonky satin stitch with open spots as opposed to a nice clean finish. So you really just want the machine to do the work when it's moving the fabric with its feed dogs, not you pushing and shoving the fabric through. Great, and now I have my interior details of my satin stitch done. And doesn't that look cute? So those are close-ups, so you don't shove the machine through, you let it do its own work. And then I always trim the loose threads as I go. Otherwise, I have to do it all at the end, and that frustrates me. So I trim it as I go. And then you trim off the ones in the back as well, or they get in the way. And then I use a tearaway stabilizer, so I can just tear this paper piece off. I've used cutaway stabilizer before, and it works. It's just a lot more effort. And then I have little bits of stabilizer in between the buttonholes, so I just make sure I get those off as well. And now we're actually ready to adhere it onto all base fabric. So the applique is all set up. It has its the applique fabric, inner facing, under. Detail work has been done. So now you're going to take your under off. So I always just kind of tear it slightly on the edge if I need to, and then not the paper backing for your under off. There we go. Maybe. There we go. And you just tear the paper backing off like this. And you just make sure as much as your paper is off as you can. If I'm doing a lot of detail work, I will not put the under on until after I do the detail work because of trying to get it out from the teeny tiny little crevices. But this one came out fairly easy. So now it will have a kind of rubbery feel on the backside where the under is ready to be adhesive onto your main backing fabric. So I'm just using a basic black square. So make sure it's flat and ironed and ready for your fabric. And you want right sides up because this is getting sewn on top. So whatever side you want your audience or your people looking at you to see is where you want to place your applique on. So I'm taking it and I'm putting my applique so it's facing up, and my main backing fabric so it's facing up. So we have a wrong side to a right side in fancy sewing language, and you just make sure it's positioned exactly how you want it and need it. And if you need to get rulers out and chalk lines out, you do that now. No matter how nice your satin stitch is, if your applique is off kilter or whatever, it won't look nice. Design is so important whenever you're doing any kind of sewing, embroidery, or applique, because even if your technique is flawless, if the design looks bad, it won't look nice at the end. So make sure the placement is exactly where you want it. And then again, my iron overheats, so I'm putting the cover on it, and then I press down and I mentally count until it's where I need it to be, which I always just do a base of like a 10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You don't necessarily want to move your iron back and forth like this because that can move your... Oh, I made a boo-boo. I made a big boo-boo. That's okay. I can still show you guys how to applique. I just won't be able to use this patch for anything. So my iron was too hot and my thingamajiggy didn't do its job. And the fabric I was using was a polyester, so it melted. Sad panda. The sides are still good, so I can finish the applique process for you, so you all know how to applique. I'm just mildly sad now. Okay, I'll live. Sad panda. Oh, we're not done yet. So after it's, at least I know it's on them. after it's on there, you're going to take your stabilizer and you're going to pin it to the back of your fabric, making sure that your entire applique is covered. I don't think I have any more time. Princess kitten. Oh my goodness. Okay. And we're back at the sewing machine, and I don't need my iron anymore, so I'm turning it off. Okay. And then you move to a basting stitch, which is back to a straight stitch, and a basting stitch, which is your longest stitch length. And you are going to sew around your stabilizer so that it's in place. Taking the pins out so you don't run into them. And it doesn't really matter. You don't have to do a security stitch or a back stitch or anything. This is just there to hold your stabilizer in place while you do your satin stitch. Now you're going to stay on the straight stitch, go back to a normal stitch length, which on my machine is at 2.5. So just whatever your default stitch length is. And you are going to do a straight stitch on the edge of your applique. And this just helps secure it in place. It's another prevention that keeps it from pulling away from the fabric you're sewing it onto. So you're just doing a straight stitch any edge. So if I had interior edges, they would get a straight stitch. All the exterior edges are getting a straight stitch. Just nice and close to the edge. Your goal is that your satin stitch will cover up this straight stitch. So you want to keep it nice and close to that edge. And then you cut the threads. And what I could have done, instead of ironing it on, since I was using a polyester fabric, is I could have done that spray-on adhesive, and that would have saved my pretty kitty. That's sad. I'm relatively sad about that. I'll go see if I have another one I can use. Anyways, you now have a straight stitch all the way on the edges of the applique, and it is ready for the actual satin stitch. This stabilizer is helping it hold up so it feels more like you're working on construction paper than on fabric, which keeps it nice and smooth and straight. So I'm going to set it back to my satin stitch settings. And you can control the width of your satin stitch just like any other zigzag stitch. So you can make it skinnier or smaller or whatever you want to do with it. I always like starting on a straight edge just so that my life is easier at the beginning and at the end of my satin stitch. And then you're aiming so that the edge of your needle, is sitting at the edge of the applique and then in the interior side. So right barely at the edge and then on the interior. And again, going slow as your friend. And then I'm coming up to a sharp curve, so I'm even going to slow down here and just make sure I'm getting those edges toned right. And then again, I'm coming to a point, so I'm going to slow down and just make sure I'm toning my fabric so that we can get that whole point somewhat even. And then angle back up. So I've done a lot of these sharp tips up here, and I found the easiest ways to get close to them and then stop, turn your fabric with your needle still in, go a couple stitches straight across, and then stop with your needle at the point, and then turn your fabric again so it's at another angle, and then stitch.
What width of stitch are you using?
What width?
Yeah.
My width is at a 6.0, and then my width is at a 6.0 right now. My detailing's width was at a 2.0, and then the length of stitch, so how much distance between each stitch, is at a 0.2. So it's after the 1 but before the 0. I believe on most non-computer machines you have to go all the way past the buttonhole setting before you get to the 0 section, I think. So again, I'm at that point. So I'm gonna stop with my needle on the outside of my applique, go across a few inches, not inches, stitches. Turn my fabric again with my needle on the outside of my applique, and go back down. Once again at that point. out of bobbin. So I did, however, prep a second bobbin in case this would happen, because I thought it might. Satin stitch takes a whole lot of thread. So what I've started doing, if I'm doing a larger satin stitch project, is I just prep like 4 or 5 bobbins of my color I need in advance. That way I don't actually have to stop and make a bobbin in the middle of sewing, and it makes my life so much nicer. So much nicer. Sweet. And then you just start back from where you left off, which was not kind of my machine because I'm right on that point. Sweet. And it's done. And I pushed through some pieces because my amount of investment in making it look nice decreased after I made my big boo-boo. But here's what it looks like when you push through your machine and you make it go faster than it should. And you see you have these spaces between your stitches. When you actually let the machine do its job, it'll look a lot smoother. It looks like that. There's no spaces between those stitches. It looks exactly like what it's supposed to, nice and smooth, and it has a sateen texture. The next step would be to seam rip your basting stitch, where you put your stabilizer on. Always use stabilizer. I didn't use stabilizer for years, and then I did once, and my life was changed forever. So what I usually do is I just do a couple stitches, and then I open it up, and I can just seam rip it through that way. And it makes it a lot easier than picking out those stitches on the flat of a fabric. Another thing I will say is I try to match applique fabric with base fabric as much as I can. So linen on linen, cotton on cotton, similar weights and things like that. You don't have to. You can do like a brocade on a linen, or linen on a brocade. I just find that the fabrics will pull on each other more if you do fabrics that are not like each other. If you're doing dissimilar fabrics, they will pull on each other, and it'll be more likely for your applique to come undone and for you to have to go in later and mend it. So if you do all the steps with the straight stitch and with the no fray, that should mitigate that problem.
Can I add to that? Use extreme caution when, if you want to do like a knit on a woven. That would be a bad idea.
I would not. I've never done a applique with knit. I have no idea how that would look. It doesn't feel like a good idea though. So I'm just going through and finishing the seam ripping of the basting stitch on that stabilizer. And the reason we do that is because you don't want around, we could just pull the stabilizer out, but then that stitch would still be there, and you don't want a stitch in the middle of your fabric that's not holding anything down. It just won't look very nice. And then I'm trimming off my loose threads because I care about things like that, even though I'm not going to keep this since I messed up on it. And then you just tear off that stabilizer. I love tearaway stabilizer. It's so much better. You do it on the outside and the inside of your applique, so the back of your fabric looks like this. And then the front of your fabric should look like this without a giant melted hole in the middle of your fabric. And that's the basics of Satin-Stitch Applique. I do have a tutorial that was gifted to me by Breeder at the beginning of my apprenticeship in the Artificers Guild, which is where I learned how to do my satin stitch. So I believe I linked it to the Google Slides, maybe not. I'll link it to the after class discussion in the Discord. And if you want it, you can always just find me on Facebook or find me on Discord, and I'll send it to you that way. Any applique questions? Oh, I will say, if you're doing an applique piece, say I'm appliquing the front of a tunic, you do the applique on that front piece before you make the tunic. That way you're only working with one piece of fabric and not a big giant tunic, and trying to finagle a big giant tunic around in your sewing machine, because that gets complicated and messy really fast. So just make sure that if you're doing it, you do it on as little amount of fabric as you can. So if you're appliquing like a collar piece, you applique the collar before you attach it to the tunic. If you're doing it on a section of skirt, you do it before you construct the entire piece, and it makes your life easier. So if this had worked out, I probably would have done it on the scrap and then appliqued the circle onto like a cloak or a pant or something. But it's got a melted hole in it, so that's not going to happen. So yeah, that is my 2 cents on Satin-Stitch Applique. Belgarth loves Satin-Stitch Applique. So if you have any questions, we got, looks like 17 minutes until Quinn is on with their roleplay in Belgarth class. So I'm here to answer those, or you can find me in Discord.
What is your consideration for choosing thread color when you're doing the outside border on your applique?
That depends somewhat. So I really like using black as my outline. Usually if I want it to blend in, I will usually choose the same color as my outside fabric. So the fabric that I'm attaching it to is what I'll use to do the satin stitch. Often, if I really want to make a statement and pop, I'll do a contrasting color. Usually not, though. A lot of what I do is when I make my digital designs, I'll play with the outline color of the applique piece to just kind of see what looks best against the fabric. And a lot of the time it ends up being black. It just looks really clean and professional. Sometimes I'll do matchy-matchy, but usually I'll do black, and it draws attention. If you don't have a black base like this, It'll draw attention to the applique without being loud and obnoxious. I don't know if that helped you at all.
I tend to do the thread to match my top fabric.
You have it match the applique piece and not
Yeah.
the under fabric.
Yeah.
Yeah, either way works. It's aesthetic preference. It really is. It's just an aesthetic preference. So some people are more aesthetically aware than I am, and they'll make cognizant aesthetic choices, and I just go, I think that'll look nice. And if I'm not positive about which one I want to use, I can get some scrap material from the base fabric and the applique fabric and just like do tiny little circle appliques or something using those base materials and scrap materials and decide what color scheme I like best. So I've done that before. I'm here for 14 minutes until Quinn is on, so feel free to ask sewing questions or disappear. I guess I should stop the recording. Okay. And then, yeah, I'm here for another, now 13 minutes.
This was perfect timing because I'm working on an applique today.
Ooh, what are you working on?
Feathers. It's the yeah.
Oh boy.
Show it. Do you have video option? I want to see.
I do. It's also, well, I guess you're in the competition, so it's fine.
Oh, the thumbs competition?
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to make my documentation for that. Ooh, fun fabric.
Yeah. It's also not same fabrics, but you know, it's fine.
Nice.
It's very cool.
So,
I
are
have
you doing
some-
any detail stitching inside those feathers?
I did do just like a straight stitch down the middle. Get it in the light there. Yeah, I can't really see it, but
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
I've made so many feathers.
That's a lot. I think you might. I did not put that much work into my
Tail.
Wow. Yeah,
So
I did
many
not put that
feathers.
much work into my project. I was like, this will be fun and this is a good excuse.
It is a good excuse.
I still really don't know what to make for that, and that's impressive.
That is so impressive, right? Like, maybe I should just not finish that documentation. No, I'll do it. Because I like competing in contests.
Also, working with linen blends is a nightmare. It's so stretchy.
Oh, yeah.
Might
I'd be
depend on the
doing
blend. What's your content?
I think it's linen rayon, if I recall correctly.
Ooh.
I want to say it was like 60-40, maybe. It's been a while since I bought it, so I don't remember for sure. It's awful.
That's interesting because I have a linen rayon that's not stretchy at all.
Do you have any spandex content in there?
I do not remember. It's very stretchy though, whatever it is. The worst.
How peculiar.
Yeah, that's odd. Well, I'm sad I melted my thingamajiggy because I have a bunch of variations of cat heads from that fabric and was thinking I would do a line of them on the hem of a cloak. But we'll see if I might still have one kitty cat head. Who knows? Maybe. Alright, Quinn will be on in 9 minutes. We can keep chatting about sewing stuff if you want. I'm happy to. I like talking about sewing stuff. And then Quinn, if you want to, you can throw your, if you're doing a PayPal or Venmo for Lynn to put on the Twitch, you can throw that up in the chat now so that he has it. I assume you're on because I see someone named Quinn who is on here. Though you may not be at your computer.